In 1941, as German forces occupied Poland and began routing the Jewish population into extermination camps, a Polish diplomat in Switzerland named Alexander Ladasch started a quiet, desperate operation, forging, stamping, and signing thousands of Latin American passports. Ladasch had identified a very specific administrative loophole. The Nazis were holding foreign passport holders in detention camps rather than death camps, hoping to trade them later for Germans detained abroad. A simple paper booklet suddenly became the literal difference between life and death. Today, we treat these heavily guarded documents as permanent, unavoidable facts of life, but humanity managed to populate the entire globe without them. If you wanted to travel in ancient Egypt, you might carry a letter of safe conduct issued by a ruler. If you were crossing through Han China, you could be handed a travel pass. For much of human civilization, borders were incredibly fluid. Even deep into the 19th century, documentation was rarely universal. A wealthy traveler might cross oceans freely, while poorer migrants arriving in the U.S. were often subjected to specific entry requirements, like passing medical eye inspections to secure health certificates. There was no standardized global tracking system. The concept that every human being requires a government-issued booklet to step foot outside their own country is a remarkably modern invention. The turning point arrived in 1914. When World War I broke out, neighboring countries and their sprawling overseas colonies were instantly transformed into wartime enemies. Terrified of espionage and mass desertion, European nations hastily erected armed checkpoints at ports of entry to confirm travelers' nationalities. The early travel papers checked at these borders were entirely chaotic. Different countries printed completely different formats, containing whatever arbitrary information local authorities decided to write down. And when the fighting stopped, the public expectation was that these irritating borders would be dismantled. In 1920, the newly established League of Nations convened to discuss exactly that, abolishing the wartime passport system entirely. But the world had changed. Citing fresh anxieties about national security, managing millions of displaced refugees, and the spread of post-war epidemics, the League opted to keep the checkpoints open, framing it as a strictly temporary measure. They never closed. By the time the League met again in 1926, the political will to abolish passports was dead. A temporary wartime panic had quietly calcified into permanent global infrastructure. Instead of tearing the system down, the League leaned in, standardizing the chaos. They issued guidelines mandating uniform booklet sizes, structured layouts, and required everything to be printed in the native language alongside French. Inside these standardized booklets, countries could now demand a visa. This was a specific legal permission stamp dictating exactly how many days a traveler was allowed to stay, and strictly limiting what they could do, like whether they were allowed to work or study. This new, highly organized architecture made it incredibly easy to enforce social divisions. The British Empire quickly began sorting its population, issuing highly valuable British passports to UK-born subjects, while funneling Indian-born subjects into a separate, distinctly lesser British Indian passport category. Because passports were entirely controlled by the state, they also became highly effective tools for domestic punishment. During the Cold War, the U.S. revoked the passport of prominent civil rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois to restrict his political influence abroad. What started as a messy logbook of travel had quickly matured into a powerful instrument of control. A government could now effectively trap its own citizens within its borders without ever building a physical wall. By the late 20th century, the heavy surveillance of border crossings relocated directly into our airports. Combined with vast digital databases, governments gained the ability to flawlessly track individual movement across the globe. There are a few regional carve-outs, like the Schengen Agreement, allowing border-free travel between 29 European countries, but these remain localized exceptions. This animated bar chart shows the stark inequality of global mobility as of 2025. A passport's true power is heavily dependent on the nation's high income status and its geopolitical alliances. Because of those alliances, a United States passport holder can enter nearly 180 countries without arranging a visa in advance. For a Pakistani passport holder, that number plummets to below 40. Even when someone tries to go through the proper channels and apply for a visa, the system remains sharply divided. In 2024, Algerian applicants seeking U.S. visitor visas faced drastically higher refusal rates than applicants from Brazil, based entirely on their country of origin. Of course, if you have enough capital, you can bypass this hierarchy entirely. More than a dozen countries run golden passport programs, legally granting full citizenship and travel access to anyone willing to make a massive cash investment. We live in an era of deeply interconnected global trade, where money and information cross oceans in milliseconds, yet human movement remains tightly locked behind a century-old wartime security measure. It forces us to ask whether arbitrary lines drawn on a map should truly dictate a human being's right to move through the world.